All right, let's get started. Welcome back to the Hot Politics Lab after, what was it, 2 or 3 week break. It felt like years, to be honest. But I'm happy to be back, and as you can see, I have a different host today. Bert Bakker is still on holiday, so I've asked Matthijs Rodan to step in for the Q&A. And let me introduce you to the speaker, Cameron Brigg. And I'm very happy to have him. I actually have a very special bond with you, Cameron. You're the last person I was in a bar with 8 months ago. So, but today that will change because after this meeting, I will have drinks with Matthijs in a bar. Well, not really in a bar. It's more like in front of a bar. So I'm hoping it won't rain and the wind will stay down. Otherwise, I think we'll have lots of beers flying in our face. Anyway, Cameron, great to have you. For those of you who do not know Cameron, Cameron joined the University of Amsterdam last year in the Department of Psychology, and he works on a climate change environment from a psychological perspective. I cannot stress, of course, how incredibly important that topic is, and I'm really happy that as the Hot Politics Lab, we are, we're going to discuss this particularly highly relevant topic. So today, Cameron will present a paper called "For Europe's Climate Change Beliefs and Attitudes: Predict Behavior and Policy Preferences Using a Latent Class Analysis on 23 countries." And he will talk for about 20 minutes, and then you can ask your questions. You can write them in the Q&A box, which is sort of in the middle of this black bar. If you have questions during the talk, you can also enter them there. All right, I'm going to yield the floor now to you, Cameron, and look forward to your talk.
Great, thank you for that nice introduction. Yes, I remember our bar visit as well, so looking forward to reprising that as soon as we can. Okay, this work is in progress. We haven't published this yet, so actually this is a great time to get your criticisms and suggestions as well. So I welcome things you have constructive criticism and that sort of thing. Great. Yes, so Gijs mentioned I've been working on pro-environmental behavior and preferences and policy and increasingly on activism in the last couple of years. But my interests here are broader, more about sort of how we address social problems in society. And in that sense, it overlaps quite a lot with your group. And that's why I've really enjoyed chatting with you and with Bert in the past. And so it's nice to connect with you, and I'd love to chat more in the future. This particular project today is led by these two guys, great thinkers and methodologists. So this is Andre and Joachim, and just wanted to say that I coordinate and supervise this project, but a lot of the heavy lifting is theirs. So all credit to them. For me, the thinking of why to do this project comes out of a broader understanding that something is shifting in Europe around climate change attitudes. That's my case, and let me see if I can convince you of some limited evidence for it. I think of tipping points as sort of rapid shifts in public opinion, and it can be very useful for us to see them in advance so we can prepare for the most effective kinds of interventions and studying the factors that matter most. And about environment, if you think back to, say, the middle of the 20th century, there was a real shift in attitudes and practices around littering, dropping trash on the street, which used to be quite common, is pretty rare now. And yeah, you'll still see it around, but it's a relative minority of people doing the vast majority, kind of Pareto principle of littering. And then later in the 80s, like 80s and 90s, when I was growing up, the recycling was starting to be a more sort of generally accepted approach and is becoming more and more normative. Here in the Netherlands, we have ongoing years discussion about the nitrogen crisis. And I've just given two suggestions here of what tipping points are possible for coming up next in the environmental domain. Climate change protest has been an interest of mine for some time, and usually at these kinds of protests, like pictured here, Extinction Rebellion in London in the UK. Where else would London be? Actually, we have a number of Londons in the US, and they have one in Canada too. So anyway, all right. So Usually at these kinds of protests, you have about 10, 15, 20 arrests. The police are not trying to arrest you. It's a big hassle for them. So generally they come by and they say, hey, you're sitting at this intersection. We'd like to move traffic back through here now. Can you move, please? And you say, I don't want to move. Please arrest me. And they go, ugh, okay, we arrest you. So what was really unusual about these protests that were happening in 2019 is how many arrests there were. This shows you this is not the hardcore center of people who have been arrested before. There's just far too many people. A lot of these people have never been arrested before, and their willingness to do so suggested to me, okay, there might be something different going on here with these Extinction Rebellion protests. And some of that momentum was cut off by the pandemic, but doesn't mean that it won't rise again. And we have the Fridays for Future and other groups worldwide as well. So, if you were to want to study attitudes, a common approach across countries, if you want to study attitudes about climate change or other policies or whatever across countries, a common approach would be to take a single variable and just look at, mean responses to it, and then look at a chart like this, and you can say, okay, well, it looks like there's strong international support for the Paris Agreement, and including in the US, even though the US administration under Trump was in opposition. And you can see the Netherlands is actually pretty low here relative to these other countries, which is interesting. I wouldn't have guessed that. But anyway, there's a major limitation of this approach, which is that we don't know whether this is the critical variable that is determining, how people vote or is central to their other kinds of attitudes. And we don't know how to combine it with 5 or 10 other relevant variables that we might have about beliefs or emotions about climate change, or and then it becomes this sort of predictor fight. My predictor explains more variance than yours, which I don't think is always the most informative way to approach it. So one alternative is to use segmentation. This is the most famous climate change segment research. It's out of the Center for Climate Change Communication and the YPCCC, the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication. And basically what they did is they used a bunch of different variables and they combined them all to yield certain classes. This is an empirical approach. And these kinds of segmentation approaches can have 2 big benefits. First, they provide a holistic sort of interpretable narrative of how beliefs change over time, because you can look at something like, is the alarmed group growing across years? And that allows you to combine from various variables, which isn't just, a single variable. And you can look at the demographics of these different groups, which can inform messaging or other types of intervention. So that's the hope, that they translate into targeted messaging and informed interventions. They haven't always led to that, but we can chat about that as well. So just to give you a little bit of background, the technique we used and that I'll present in a moment is called latent class analysis. Other types of segmentation include k-means clustering, and these are fairly uncommon. I just heard in political science, and they're actually fairly uncommon in social psychology as well. But I think they're quite valuable. So instead of being variable centered, like you can imagine getting out of the analysis or regression table, which has a beta weight for a certain predictor, they're person centered, which means that the output of the analysis is telling us what class the person is in, combining various kinds of variables. And so it's a very different way to think, and it's a bit hard even to look at the results, but we'll look at those in a second. Given a bunch of people that vary on some dimensions, and here's a scatter plot of dots, the sort of question that the LCA is asking is, how many groups are there here, and how would we separate them? And so it kind of looks from the way that it's drawn here that there's 3 classes, right? Like you might think, okay, let's draw it like that. And we can say empirically how the model fit is for 2 classes, 3 classes, 4 classes. And this one would probably segment into 3. The math gets pretty complex when you start dealing with more than one predictor variable, this is 2 predictor variables, I guess, X and Y. But imagine that we have 20. And so this multi-dimensional space is more difficult to form into classes, but that's what the LCA is doing. And then you compare the fit between different levels. In this particular project, we did a lot of work before the analyses, planning what we were going to do. And this is especially necessary when you have, cross-sectional data. But here we wanted to put in this extra work because it wasn't totally let me just say this. One of the main limitations of latent class kinds of analyses is that it seems kind of arbitrary how many classes there are and what to call them and whether you're finding them in different data sets. So like the major problem of replicability, is similar to think of an SEM model. Like I'm sure you've all seen this sort of spaghetti SEM model that has 30 pathways and probably isn't identified, and you're thinking, okay, yeah, it fits. You have decent fit, but I bet you wouldn't find that again in another data set. So one of the ways to deal with that is to model in a random half of the data and then cross-validate it in the unseen holdout sample. And because we have quite a lot of data here, at least for social psych, we had plenty of power to do that. So another reason we had to do all this sort of if-then contingency planning for the design is because of the multi-level structure between the different countries. It's already medium challenging to fit a decent model in one country, but to try and come up with a solution across multiple countries, we had to make various analytic decisions. And the point of this slide is just to tell you that we did that up front before we saw the results. So here are some of the results. And instead of showing you the predictors up front, I'm going to now walk through them in the next 2 slides. This slide is showing you the 5 categorical predictors. And so you see here in the upper left, the question, do you think the world's climate is changing? 1, definitely changing. And I forget what the top end of that scale is, but the high end would be not at all changing. And you can see that we ended up with a 4-class solution. And so this is showing across the 4 classes, what proportion answered what for each of the items. So that's sort of 3 things going on. It's a little bit confusing, but just to orient you, it means that this first class, we have almost everyone saying the world's climate is definitely changing. And we don't have, anyone in the high end of this scale, and you have to get over to classes 3 and 4 before you get much purple or pink here, which is meaning 3 or 4 on that response. So we have, even for this item, you could just eyeball it. It looks kind of like they're, classes 1 and 2 are quite similar. So it's probably that classes 1 and 2 are differing on other items, not this one. And that's why we ended up with this model fit. So it's hard to look at any individual item and get the models out, the classes out. But you can get some sense of the classes from looking at these. And what I'm looking for when I look at these kinds of results is, does it track as you would expect, like from one side to the other? Or, if in this 4th class you suddenly got a lot of support for the climate changing, that would be weird. But these results look as you would expect, like they generally track. You can see one exception in the 5th question there. And here are a bunch of continuous items that this is the same kind of information from the last slide, but because it's not a categorical anymore, we can show you this on a more continuous scale. And what you see is that the alarmed class, which is at the top here, is highest on nearly all of these items, not the first one. And that mostly the classes are somewhat separated. You can also think of this analogous to a kind of item response theory kind of analysis. I don't know if you've seen those scalloping response items, but just to say, okay, do these classes look like they're separating, and are they separating in a consistent way, or what kinds of items? And broadly speaking, having looked at some of these models, yes, these look reasonable. There are some items that are a bit different than expected, but that's okay. Now, if you take all of that together, and I wanted to show you this first, this is the sort of overall story that you get. We see across all these countries in Europe, a 4-class solution fits best, which frankly is really helpful, because it could have been 10 classes and really hard to name, and it wasn't, so that's nice. This is an empirical decision more than a feel one, although there is some feel to this type of analysis. This covers all of Europe while testing for heterogeneity and invariance across countries. The measurement and configural invariance were a challenge in this project. Now, these revealed classes are already interesting to me, like just finding out that the labels that we've given them, the names, that's from us. So that's a weak part of the project. We could certainly hear your input if you have any about how to characterize them differently. But we see a lot of people in the middle, which was interesting to me, and more dismissive than I expected, because I thought that the dismissive was more characteristic of the US. These revealed classes also predict individual conservation and behaviors and collective actions like attending protest. And what's a little bit unique about that compared to previous research is that in previous research, many people used those behaviors as part of the LCA. They used the behaviors to help sort people into classes, whereas we just did sort of attitude and belief kinds of items and then predicted behaviors separately, which is a little bit more strenuous. Stringent? Strenuous? I think I want stringent, yeah. And by using, one of the benefits of using large-scale panel data like this is that if they repeat these questions in future panels, then you really have a very good opportunity to test for these same classes with using the same items in a large project using that sort of thing. And I mentioned that because most of the previous segmentations use ad hoc items and one-off samples, which makes it pretty difficult to integrate new results. It is also true, I mentioned invariance a moment ago. It's also true that the class results in proportion were very different between the different countries. And I will tell you, just in anticipation, if anyone wants to ask me, did you fit all those classes, like 1 to 10 classes for every country, looking at which one fit best? We weren't able to test the multi-level version of this LCA because it was going to take weeks to run a single cycle. And so it was a bit of a computational limitation for us. And it is also true that there are some countries that when you look at them individually, the 4-class solution is not the best. It's not the closest fit, like some of them 5 and such like that. So it isn't that you can take these 4 classes and then immediately dive into, say, the Netherlands, which I've flagged there, and be really confident. You would want to do that for that specific country. The results I showed you earlier are for Europe overall. This is the last results slide. Then I just have a couple closing comments. And this is showing you the predictive utility of these classes above and beyond the sort of social demographics that you might use, like political affiliation, age, gender, and those sorts of variables. And you can see that the change in the model fit is modest for adding the classes, but it is there for all of these types of outcomes. And of course, if you use the classes alone, then you would find larger effects than these. This is the effect beyond this sort of socio-demographics that one might expect to use. Okay. I just wanted to mention to your group that I coordinate a database of open, let's see how I can share this. I'll share it in a second. A database of open data that's relevant to psychology, but also political science. And we use this in teaching, and students who have limited funding can go and do these kinds of analyses with, on huge scale data without much work. So It's a nice resource, totally free. Oh, and in all the talks I'm giving recently, I'm mentioning these two papers, this one from 2018 about gender inequity, and then the follow-up, which was in 2019, which was more about ethnicity and race, showing that women and members of underrepresented ethnic and minority groups are invited less to give talks, and when they apply to give talks at conferences, particularly conferences like this one, where their demographic information and name are visible while people are judging the abstracts, that is, they're not blinded, they're also given talk opportunities less often than their proportion in the population. Like, of course, there are already a small proportion of the population, but they're given even less than that proportion of talk invitations. Okay, so let's do as good as we can on that in the future. And thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Cameron. Very interesting. For people who have questions, could you please share them, not in the chat, but in the Q&A box. Thank you. While we wait for the first questions to appear, I wanted to ask one question. I'm not that familiar with latent class analysis. But what I found striking when you presented the results, what you can see is that you have these 4 classes, and they basically all present a continuum from more worried to less worried. So to what you explained, that latent class analysis is more person-oriented instead of variable-oriented. So my question basically is, in this case, what does it add when we find that it's basically a continuum? Is that an interesting additional finding, or is that something that we basically already knew? I was a bit struggling with my interpretation of it, so maybe you could say a bit more about that.
No, it's a really, really great question. Yeah, so I have 2 main responses to that. And the first is, we didn't know that before we did it. And so that's one reason why it's worth testing this way. And the second one is that actually, in addition to them broadly fitting this sort of more worried, less worried kind of thing, the pattern that I found most interesting was, let's see here, where were the, yeah, so we have some people who are saying climate change is happening, it's bad, I'm worried about it, and we can't do anything, and I'm not personally going to do anything. And I found that combination pretty different than, you know, it's bad, it's real, it's happening, and I think countries can deal with it, and I think it's government responsibility, or I'll take personal responsibility, whatever. So there seems to be some disconnects in here. One of the most interesting is that one, where you can get people who are like, yeah, I support the Paris Agreement, and no, I don't have any collective efficacy that we're going to pull this off. I find that disjoint interesting.
Yeah, I see. So basically the thing is that in these 2 different groups, people might score similarly on some variables about how, what they think about climate change, for instance, but then on other variables, they really strongly differ from each other when it comes to what to do with it or how important it is. Or
that's right. And my particular focus in the last few years is mostly on predicting pro-environmental behaviors, including policy support and contacting elected officials and activism. And so that distinction is probably important for action, because people who don't have a sense of efficacy aren't going to do it.
Yeah. Thanks. There is a question from Robin Churchill. A quick methodological one. Is latent class analysis similar to topic models, LDA? And that means, do individuals get one class assigned, or do they get scores of probabilities?
Yeah, in this case, they do get assigned to one class. I think that there is a way that you can get a sort of a fitting of each person to each class, which is that sort of additional level of detail, but I don't have those, I don't have that information right in front of me, sorry.
I had one other question about when you presented the overview of the differences between countries. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about where you think these differences come from? Because there were pretty big differences. I mean, it's of course a very general question, but How do you think, where does it come from that in one country these classes are really different from other countries, not just in terms of percentages like you showed us, but also in terms of how many classes you can distinguish?
Ah, wow. Yeah, boy, that is a complex one. I'd be totally speculating, and so I'll go for that. Here you go.
Can do that, yeah. Right.
I mean, I think about this kind of, it's hard to not think of the United States when I think of this question, because the media landscape in the US with Fox News and other groups is so different than in many other similarly developed countries, that you end up with very different public opinion as a result, and different sorting, and different, you would have different classes there. And so looking across Europe, if you want to compare France to Sweden or something, boy, there's a lot of variables to consider. But I would certainly think first about the media landscape and about how the population is receiving information, because that's going to determine their sorting and their sort of following of the elite cues, which is really important in these kinds of responses. I think that one of the big things, who was it? Zaller, early 90s? Yeah. One of the big things I took away from that work is that, when people are answering these questions, many of them are not reflecting a deeply held, consistent, coherent, sophisticated set of beliefs, like the person who's studying them might hold, but instead can be just sort of more gut reflections and temporary things that won't even be true of that same individual later.
Just one additional question about this. Do you see, or do you probably you don't know yet, but do you expect that things are changing in Europe? Because you say the United States is really different, but my observation, I'm just it's just a guess, it's just a hunch, but that things really are changing because this topic is increasingly important and also increasingly politicized, because in many countries radical right parties now also take like climate skeptical opposition, something that was not really there until a couple of years ago in Europe. So do you think things are changing in Europe in this sense?
I would love to find that out. I'm honestly too new here to have much of a confident thing to say about that, but I'm looking forward to learning more about that.
Yeah. There is one question by Disa Sauter. I like the emphasis on structural explanations, but I was wondering whether you think there are personality correlates of these four types.
It's an interesting question. I haven't looked to see in the ESS if they have Big Five style personality types. If anyone knows, they can type that into the Q&A. I think that would be interesting. But I would guess yes. Just that I haven't found it very actionable when we identify personality types. Like, I'm not sure how to take that to marketing or messaging intervention, but every time I have a good measure of personality, in particular on environmental topics, openness, I do find that it predicts unique variants. So I'm guessing that something in here is going to be related to that. So openness, especially being characterized by flexible, abstract thinking and enjoying thinking about hard problems and thinking about long-term and long-distance events, is very well suited. People high in openness are going to be more receptive and more aware of the consequences of climate change.
How about agreeableness and people being cynical, not trustworthy? Could imagine that one.
Yeah, I know more about which ones predict behavior across different types of behaviors than I do about climate change belief. So I'm not sure, but I don't know about attitudes and beliefs so much. Yeah. Agreeableness is not so important for behavior.
There is one question by Robin Churchill. I also put my hand up for more substantial ones, but here goes in case you prefer written ones. You started out by saying something about tipping points, but didn't really get back to that. Can you relate to your findings to the idea that there might be a tipping point in public attitudes or beliefs concerning climate change?
Yeah. So when I showed you the 6 Americas data, and when I look back at that body of work, one of the reasons why it has been so influential and so useful, I think, at least to my thinking, is that they did it over time. They were able to take that approach and then use a longitudinal sort of country level or multi-country perspective to look at whether there are shifts in the class proportion over time and what are the demographics of those different classes, because that gives you it's a new kind of perspective on how is public opinion about climate change. And I just see a lot of that discussion currently still being about single variables. So it's just a nice way to get at that. And now that we've done this work, we could follow it up with newer data and just see if the classes fall out again, hopefully in the same sort of panel. That's the hope. Oh, and let's see here. So sorry, I didn't connect this explicitly, but the tipping points is like being able to monitor when there are these rapid, radical shifts in beliefs or attitudes that are presenting the opportunity for wedge issues in politics and then different types of public policy.
There's a second question of Robin. Do you think that the rather technical and energy policy focused data of the ESS in 2016 that you use might bias your findings a bit towards the disengaged?
Yes, that's a brilliant question. Yes, we are constrained by the items. We didn't, construct them, and I would say that it is lean. It does lean that way. I think there's a nice diversity of items. I'm not too concerned about it overall, but it may focus people into the disengaged class because most people don't have strong opinions about those things. That was a really good point.
So the idea would be that because these are very technical questions and people do not have ideas about it, the Zeller thing you mentioned, and that therefore they are basically forced in the disengaged category.
That by including more items relative to others that are fairly technical, that we bias our analyses towards identifying or having more people in a class that we might look at and consider disengaged, as opposed to if we had a ton more questions about emotion or something.
Yeah. A question by Philip Mendoza. A very interesting presentation, thank you. I'm wondering whether a presentation of these groups along a two-dimensional space may be more instructive. Why did you decide for the single dimension? For example, X, is it real? And why can we do something about it?
Yeah, that's a nice suggestion. I guess we hadn't thought of which two variables are kind of the most important. When I presented the 4 classes, it wasn't a single dimension, I would say. Like we sort of summarized as more concern, more willingness to act, more, it's sort of combining across multiple dimensions using our summary language. But you're making me think about the graphing. That's a nice idea. And I think it would address Matthias's earlier question about why these classes are more than a unidimensional reveal. I'm gonna remember that.
Yeah, exactly, because you explained the way you explained why it is relevant. The latent class analysis was pretty convincing because you find 2 different things, right? There are 2 different types of variables involved, and I think this suggestion by Philip is really
that's
good.
nice. Thank you very much.
Tobias Rohrbach asks, what are the implications or consequences of your 4-class solution for your future research in terms of measurement, analysis, and research designs?
Yeah, for me, it's methodologically, it was interesting that we came up with an empirical result that for me had enough security and fit that we could say, yes, we've handled the measurement and variance across all these different countries, and this is a reasonable summary. I didn't know if that was going to be possible. So on the method sense, I'm like, oh wow, you can look at a bunch of countries. And just to put that out there, I mean, it may even be surprising that it was possible in the US at all, because the US is also a tremendously large area with many disparate groups, linguistic, ethnic, monetary, whatever. So that's the method side. In terms of future research, what I would do is try and verify in other data sets whether this 4-class solution is a decent fit there as well in Europe. I wouldn't expect that there would be 4 classes necessarily in other territories, but there's a lot of other European data using different types of items, and one could borrow our approach and just try it there without having to do all the background work that we did. A quick comment about that though, finding 4 classes is not saying that one has replicated the same exact pattern that we see here. One would want to look at the composition of the classes, the sort of the interpretation level. And so you could identify 4 classes, but they could be different classes. And there's a hand-wavy sort of art part to that in LCA.
What kind of variables do you think are really missing from this analysis, like more emotional attachments or what?
Gosh, honestly, there's a lot of other variables that I'm interested in. I'm leaning lately towards identity, like social identity variables, and I would love to see how people sort themselves into different groups, because that could give you some sense of where the information is coming from.
How do you mean exactly social identity in this case?
Oh, like what social group memberships people feel strongly about. We always ask people about their political party affiliations and their sort of ideology, you know, left, right on economic or social terms, fine. But there are lots of other groups that people belong to. So that's something I would like to see more of. Robin, I see in the chat mentioned that there's a direct replication of the 6 Americas work in Germany, 5 classes. Yes, whether those 5 classes are the same as the 6 is difficult to say, but that's interesting work. There's about 5 or 6 more such papers, Australia, Singapore, and I've just written them all up into the introduction. So if anyone wants that literature, feel free to bug me. I have it all in a folder.
What do you think are the normative implications for finding, for me it was striking that the disengaged category was so big. What does that mean?
Well, yeah. I mean, at once when you look at we should be hesitant here, but at once when we look at the sort of, okay, almost everyone thinks it's real and it's happening, but that's different than it used to be. So maybe that's not the most productive place to look for intervention. We could, in particular on these results, I wouldn't try and message towards the people that are actively saying the sort of the strong deniers. I would think, okay, maybe the point here is it's still possible. It's possible for us to make swift, effective change to our economic systems to stay below, 1.5, 2 degrees warming. So that I would probably say, okay, let's focus on there's hope, and here are the ways, and here are the people that are helping, kind of a heroes and villains story.
That would be a more successful intervention.
I don't know, but that's what I would lean towards here, because a lot of these people are saying, yeah, it's real. Yeah, we're doing it. Yeah, it's bad. So those maybe aren't the most important points to talk about.
No. Yeah, and that's also, by the way, that also means that you would never have found this without this latent class approach, right? Because it's this combination of these variables.
I think you could have, if you had kept those specific variables in mind, and then you'd compared like this cluster to that cluster, but boy, it would be hard to do it in practice. I probably would have missed it. I don't think I would have seen it in the data.
Yeah. So will you now, in your future research, basically build on these classes you have now distinguished? Will all your future research build on this, or will this be one project and you will focus on other more regular methods?
This is a bit of a distraction for me from my main bread and butter, which is the more survey and experimental work. I don't know. I don't know what we'll do. This data is from 2016. It's taken a long time to do this project. It was analytically quite challenging. So now that it's done, it would be really nice to do it again for data from 2020, for example. We need to find the right survey that has appropriate items for doing that. So that would be a nice follow-up that would be a lot less than twice as much work as this project. I don't know. I don't know what we'll do next.
And my expectation would be that now, 2016 was really, I think, really different from the situation right now. In particular, I think this was, what were the data, the ESS combined? No, the data you were using here, yeah.
Yep.
that was really, I mean, the situation was so different when it comes to climate change, and in particular when it comes to the political debate about the issue. And I think therefore also the way people think about it. So my expectation would be that that there will be huge changes, that you will find huge changes within these 4 years. Maybe only in when it comes to the percentages and not in the configurations of how these variables relate to each other. But still, that would be really. Is it included in the last wave of the ESS?
No, unfortunately, not this stuff.
Nothing of these variables,
Yeah.
or
no, okay. They didn't do the climate change part.
Yeah.
Matthijs, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Just trying to get your attention for a while.
Sorry, you're partly covered by my Q&A box.
That explains it. What was my question? Yeah, so Cameron, I was curious if you could say a bit more about the two middle categories. So the resigned and what was the other name?
Disengaged.
Disengaged. Yeah. What is really the difference between these groups, and because I guess this is the most interesting distinction, particularly particularly the most important reason to use LCA. But can you say a bit more about it, how they are different and what this means for their behavior?
Gosh, that is a real challenge. Maybe we could just look at them together. I'm not 100% sure what to say about them. Let's see here. That's the right screen, hopefully.
Yep.
So you asked to, here between orange and purple, how are they differing? And you can see they're quite divergent on climate change having a good or a bad impact. They have a couple variables that they're similar on. What we saw is sort of across the board, the resigned are saying that it's not going to work out. Like, yeah. And so we needed something slightly different, because whether or not they take personal responsibility and whether or not they think that it's bad, there's another level, which has come up a couple of times now, like about whether governments and people and themselves are going to reduce the energy use. I don't know what we should call these groups, and I welcome other suggestions.
Yeah, I think I would agree with this classification, the labels, I mean.
Robin says in the chat that maybe the resigned are the activists who have given up, and the disengaged are ones that haven't thought very much about it. And I think that reveals the limitations of this data set, like that we don't know how seriously they think about their answers, their sort of confidence or elaboration, justification, their consistency across time. We don't really have any of those things. So that's a totally reasonable explanation. We would need a different kind of data to really answer that.
Yeah, and I can also see that, for example, the second question, how confident you could use less energy than now. I mean, for some people, it would be really hard to use even less energy, right? The base level use of energy is, of course, very different. So,
no, that's a very good point, because that's a sort of a relative difference from now, where they're not starting from the same point. So yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah. And what about these? So at the end, you showed these what it means if you add these categories to predictive models of action. Yeah, yeah.
I slipped by it, sorry.
Yeah, this one. So do you see differences here in what resigned can predict and what dismissive can predict?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I don't know offhand. I'd have to look into that, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
I was One thing about the four classes, the disengaged class, dismissive class. You also mentioned the word efficacy.
Yeah.
Right. Isn't that something different to some extent? Or it's more about the extent to which you think that you can do something about it, right? Instead of how engaged you are.
Yeah. Those are different.
That might be really different things.
They might be. And in terms of efficacy, I think that the items sort of neatly divide between more collective efficacy, like it can be done by a group, and I personally can do something.
Yeah.
And maybe I misrepresented that, because definitely different things.
There were two comments by Sami Mustakama, who says that some of the items are now part of the ESS, 3 to 6 of them, so of the core ESS.
Oh, okay.
So it might be interesting to check that.
Oh, wow.
So just,
I didn't
Still, of
know
course.
that. Let me leave some notes for myself. Very useful.
And then there is a question by Disa, but the resigned feel more personal responsibility, ? So do the resigned feel more personal responsibility?
It appears so. And let me just think that maybe we should generate some of these comparisons between these two groups graphically, because it's kind of hard to interpret, and I'll need to go do that work and look at it. Yeah.
And Disa says, it would also be interesting to see the categorical data as well to compare the two groups.
Yeah, that's what I just responded to. And thank you, Disa. That's a really helpful piece of input.
I have one more question when you're ready, Cameron.
Yeah, shoot.
Okay. So we discussed the LCA, the technique a little bit before actually starting the talk, and I was wondering, is there sort of a confirmatory way to do LCA?
Okay, I think of this. I have given this some thought, and we did do this sort of testing sample, holdout sample, confirmatory process here. But there's certain parts of it that are easy to make confirmatory, and others not. And so it's kind of, unfortunately, it's the most trivial part that's easiest, like how many classes are there, and the sort of breakdown questions that we've been nicely struggling with here are harder to formalize. But anything that you can get out of the model, which is, number of classes, model fit, proportion, you can test as a hypothesis.
Yeah. Okay. No, I get it. So what and what are the relevant fit criteria for latent class models?
Yeah. Let's see. What do I have here? There's a bunch of them, and you look at them together. Where do I have all this? I can pull this up in just a moment. Oh, but it's going to be the AIC and the BIC, and we have what is the one that starts with E? I'm just on the spot here. I'm forgetting. There's sort of like a entropy. Entropy is relevant for LCA.
Okay.
And you look at all of them, and there's some general guidelines.
Is there a methodologically developed way in which you can then also test the equivalence across countries? Because now I'm, of course, thinking about structural equation modeling, the more confirmatory factor analysis, stuff like that. Do you have an equivalent of equivalence testing here?
There are some papers that are about this problem. I wouldn't say there's a consensus of a clean or easy way to do it, but I think people generally agree about the most important characteristics. And we did that in this project. I also don't have a lot of details in front of me about how that exactly was done.
It might, by the way, now I think about it, what might be interesting for you is to look at the when it comes out, the National Election Survey. That will probably also have a couple of questions about climate change in the Netherlands. And it would be an interesting case because so much has changed here in terms of the importance of the issue and the way in which parties have used the issue in their political messaging. So it would be interesting to see if there are, I think there are more than one variable, different types of variables doing something with climate change, and to see how it works in this particular case, because we have very
that'd be great.
recent data about that. So that might be worthwhile to focus on that.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion. I'm just scrolling through my results here, looking for the fit stats. Here we go. I can just give you a vision of what this looks like. Hopefully this shows a table, right?
Yep.
All right, so there you see the kind of fit statistics and why we selected 4 classes as opposed to the other ones.
Yeah.
This isn't just about fit, though. It's also like a process of looking at the different items and the separation of the classes into items and whether they make some sort of coherent story. So there is some hand waving, but we were happy with this fit.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with when it comes to exploratory factor analysis. You have the elbow, which can then help you decide how many, right? So, but that is all. It's always debatable. Where is the elbow? Where is the real, like?
That's exactly it. This is like a scree plot, and if you look over at the change in BIC, that's the sort of elbow point of the graph. Yep.
Cameron, let me ask you a more substantive question. You said a little bit about this already, but what would be the questions that you would design ideally to be able to describe the different attitudes towards climate change?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, let me think. Everything for me is in service of what people do, their action. So like it's all colored for me in terms of what would be the best predictor of that. And I guess trying to think about your question in the more general term, like how do people think about climate change and what's the best way to sort them? I'd be interested in their beliefs about physical systems, in their attitudes about whether certain changes they perceive are good or bad. Yeah. I mentioned social group memberships earlier, but there, boy, are there a lot of other factors that are relevant to how people are using that information. And like, do they know what should be done about it in their personal lives? Do they know what actions at the government level would help? Like proportionately, you could ask people factual questions, even as specific as like, would it help more if you stopped driving a car or if you stopped eating beef? And some people will be a lot more informed about which of those are most important. And some of that will explain differences in how they react. Of course, there's going to be giant disconnects there, because even if people know those things, it doesn't mean they do them, which is, true of me as much as it is of all of you, I'm sure.
Yeah. Now, I'm always struck by the huge discrepancies between indeed beliefs, attitudes, and actions, particularly with climate change. But that also makes it a bit hard to. I mean, what I like about your presentation is that you quite clearly separate between attitudes and actions, or attitudes, beliefs, and actions. I think that's definitely an important piece of progress compared to some earlier work. But and the problem also remains that even if we would be interested in action, then we still get survey reports on action, which I'm
glad you brought that up, because that's where I wanted to go next. Just to point out that these self-report in the ESS and in, 98 of the literature on conservation and environmental psychology is self-report.
Yeah.
I'm increasingly convinced that these that these measures are so full of error and bias that we should be interpreting them differently than we are right now. Like, yeah, that was known, but I think it's actually much worse than we thought that it was. And so we have a new project. I don't know if anyone's heard of Christian Nielsen and his team, but we have a new project that's in development now where they have really great fine-grained evidence about people's clothing behaviors, like washing, drying, purchasing, whatever. And you can take all that and you can get a score of impact across all kinds of different things. But like, let's take for the case here, carbon emissions. And then you can compare those self-reported fashion behavior, to the actual impact of their behavior, to which of the kinds of predictors predict which. And it will not surprise you, but I find it really disturbing that the sort of attitudes, behaviors, whatever predictors predict the self-reported behavior, but they don't predict the actual impact very well. Impact is predicted by income and what country you're in, because that determines the energy mix. Like in Poland, a lot of coal. Drying your clothes in a dryer in Poland is very carbon intensive relative to other countries. So no, we have a real problem there. And that's anyone who wants to talk about objective measures of environmental impact, that's a new interest of mine over the last few years.
That's the new frontier. Great. It was great having you, Cameron. We're almost out of time. So I want to thank you for this great talk and lots of things that I think we should think about. I think there's a lot of interesting potential for social scientists to work on climate change. And
that's great. And I just want to say this group asked unusually great questions. I have presented this a couple of times before, and I never got half this much great input to share with the team. So I'm really looking forward to talking to the other authors about what you said.
Sure. Yeah, you're welcome. And I think at least 25% of that credit should go to Matthijs. Thank you so much, Matthijs, for jumping in today and helping.
You're welcome.
And let me just announce the schedule. Next week, Friday, we also talk about climate change, actually, with Robin Chuchel, who asked 25% of the other questions today. So really happy that we're covering more of the climate change topic. And actually, we had another speaker for next week because it's Graduate Friday again, but she canceled. So if you're a PhD student and you're looking for a stage, then shoot me an email at g.schumacher@uva.nl, and there is room for you. So also, please, feel free to spread the word about this. Then the week after, it's already June. It's June 4th, and we'll have Loes Aaldering from the Free University of Amsterdam giving a talk about leadership traits. And the week after that, June 11, I will give a talk titled Doing Psychophysiological Research in Political Science. The week after that, June 18, Bert Bakker will give a talk, and I'm not really sure what it is about. My gut says that it's about personality and ideology, but it might be something else. Then the last meeting of this academic year will be June 25 with no less than 4 presentations from our brain and cognition interns who are collecting EEG data on various different experiments that relate to politics. So really exciting schedule. And so we'll be here with you 3 to 4 every week, same link and same time. So thanks everyone for participating, and hope to see you next week.